So now we're starting with French Renaissance theater history. Looking at your board notes, we'll start with 1402, the Confrérie de la Passion. That organization began in 1402, and by 1518 they had gotten a second license, which allowed them a complete monopoly on all public performances in France. So most likely in Paris, but that's predominantly the center at that point in time of France. So they were had sort of a stranglehold on any kind of public performances, at least in Paris, if not all surrounding areas. And the strength they had sort of diminished as it went beyond Paris. So later on you'll find that there'll be companies performing outside of Paris for that reason, that it soon becomes very centralized to just Paris. So in 1402 is when they're created by Charles IV, I believe it was, and given that license. But then in 1518 they got another license that sort of solidified that they were the only ones allowed to have full total monopoly. They will continue on until about 1677. We'll continue talking about them as we go throughout this. 1493, the first edition of Terence's plays is published. This is really important because there was actually an illustration of the Terence stage in there that gave them sort of an idea of how to stage their works that lasted well into the mid-16th century. Some French authors started writing their plays in that manner, in the classical manner. It wasn't until about 1540 that you start seeing plays by the Greeks, Romans, and recent Italian plays, or treatises by Aristotle, Horace, and a lot of what we would consider sort of neoclassical, the classics coming back in, printed in French. And that's when the Renaissance starts to take hold. So after 1540, this starts really showing up because these classical treatises and works and plays and whatnot started becoming infused into France. And that really kicked off with the reign of Francis I. France and Italy had maintained pretty good relationships from about 1494 on. They had plenty of wars between the two of them, but in general they had a good working relationship with artists and theoreticians and whatever from 1494 on. So Francis I, utilizing this, started bringing in a lot of Italian artists, again because the more cultured you are, the more powerful your nation is. And so he would ship in all of these Italian artists, and from that came a new sort of artistic style known as the School of Fontainebleau. And you'll see that on your list there, right under Francis I there. And the School of Fontainebleau was sort of a new style of art in general. As a matter of fact, even led into architecture. It was that created, sort of pushed the remodeling of the Louvre to be restored and rebuilt in the Renaissance style. Keep in mind, though, that a lot of medieval influences are still pervading in French drama for quite some time, even into the Renaissance. And you'll see that as we go on here, looking at the next thing, 1500 to 1550, you have two types of drama predominantly going on at the same time. You've got outdoor religious type festival dramas, much like the mystery plays, which the Confrérie de la Passion was first by Charles commissioned to do because they did them so well. That's why they got a monopoly on it. So these dramas were still going on by 1500 and up to 1550, just about. And these were sort of outdoor dramas. They were very medieval in nature. Then you had sort of indoor dramas and plays, and those were sort of more Renaissance style in nature. We haven't hit Italianate scenery yet, so the scenery for quite a while is going to remain sort of medieval in nature, small pieces set about the stage and so on and so forth. But for this short time, roughly 1500 to 1550, you start seeing medieval and Renaissance styles of theater existing side by side, which really doesn't happen so much in any of the other countries we talk about with regard to the Renaissance. By the way, we're in France, so I'm drinking wine, which I hate, by the way, so this is really just all for you guys. Gives me headaches too, so I'm suffering for you. So, continuing further, we look at farces and sotties. That's the Renaissance type. So if you're looking at well, farces which you're familiar with. Sotties are sort of like based on medieval type farces. They're sort of satires, social, political, or even religious, depicting the characters all as fools. So those are sort of based on medieval farces. So really you're talking about comedy here. We're not talking about these Renaissance styles of theater being deep tragedy or Shakespeare level, because they aren't at this point. That won't come for a little while. Excuse me. Henri II is next on your list here. Henri II is important because when he succeeded to the throne, the Renaissance influences really began to accelerate. A group of writers in around 1550, known as the Pléiades, they appeared and started creating French dramas that were modeled on classical works. But some of the most characteristic entertainments of that time were festivals and tournaments, in which actually Henri II died. He was jousting, and the splinter from one of the lances got lodged in his eye through the faceplate there, lodged into his eye, and it went septic and swelled and eroded away his brain, so he had 3 horrifyingly painful days languishing as he died. So there you go, more information than you really need to know, but there it is. The interesting thing about that is after his death, his wife, Catherine de' Medici, you might have heard the name before, if not, you should. Medici were one of the most powerful families in Renaissance Italy. She continued these festivals and tournaments in his honor, and they sort of grew into this new style called the ballet de cour. And that is basically your Italian intermezzi and English masque. That's the equivalent of that. They were very lavish, and again, stories about court and so on and so forth. I think the most important ballet de cour was one known as Ballet Comique de la Reine. It is considered the fullest expression of the ballet de cour. His story is, if I remember, Circe luring men to a life of vice and turning them into beasts. So insert your joke about art imitating life here. So that's where their sort of intermezzi level came out of, is their tournaments and whatnot, and festivals and shows there. In 1548, that's your next thing on here, the Hôtel de Bourgogne is built by actually the Confrérie de la Passion. They were having sort of scurrilous attacks on them because they were doing some things that were a little risque in some of their shows, and making them drag out long so people couldn't go to their businesses anymore. So they were under attack. So they kind of got booted out of where they were. So they built their own theater, the Hôtel de Bourgogne, and it became one of the most important theaters of that era. Dimensions aren't exactly known, but it's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of about 40 feet wide and 105 feet deep. So if you sort of take the globe, pull it out to make it a full rectangle of those dimensions, 40 by 105, that's what we're really kind of looking at as the basic dimensions of this. Now the stage would be the full 40 feet, and the galleries, it would be sort of three stories up, would have come out. It did never proscenium arch, but the galleries came all the way to the stage area there, so it sort of framed that stage area. Keep in mind though that then from a sightline perspective, the people in the boxes not being able to see people under here, and these people not being able to see people under here, you come down to sort of about a 25-foot area from dead center, 12 and a half feet or so on either side. It's actually visible playing space for everybody. So it sounds like a nice wide stage, but really it ends up kind of not being so. And the bottom gallery there were completely open, so that it was more of like an amphitheater there. It did have a pit, just like the English styles did. And the stage depth was somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 17 to 35 feet deep. So not incredibly deep as well. 1548 is our next thing here. I'm sorry, we did just discuss that, but 1548 also religious plays are banned. This was kind of important insofar as the the Confrérie de la Passion could no longer do their religious plays, and so therefore they had to switch over to secular drama, secular meaning non-religious. And so that was the impetus for them to start moving over to producing plays that were not religious based. So by the 1570s, all these changes that had taken place thus far with the Confrérie de la Passion sort of loosened that grip a bit. And you start to see a lot of professional theater companies taking up residence outside of Paris. Again, the monopoly was still strong enough in Paris, but now that sort of outlying area was open to them. So they would create professional companies outside of Paris. People would go out to see the shows and then come back in town. But the problem also at this time is that there was a lot of civil unrest because of the wars between the Catholics and the Huguenots. The Huguenots are the Protestants. That's their term for the Protestants. And it was a problem. It began around 1540-ish, but it really didn't come to a head until around 1570s. And that was mainly because there was thousands of Protestants who were murdered in the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. Now the Catholics had gained all this power through someone by the name of the Duke of Guise. And Henri III was afraid of his power, and so he had him assassinated. Well, it's just, I guess, the best way to deal with someone whose power you're afraid of is to have them killed. So that happened, and it sort of slowed the tide of the Civil War, but not really. It sort of made it a little smolder. The next thing we see here on your board notes is 1572, Jean de la Terre. Now, this is an important one because Jean de la Terre published a work advocating the three unities: time, place, and action. If you recall, those are three things that are very important in the Italian neoclassical ideal. So this is the emergence of neoclassicism in Renaissance France. Now, it wasn't greatly adhered to because a lot of the writers at the time didn't like the sort of stringent, dictation or whatever of neoclassical ideal in their writings. They liked things to be more entertaining and exciting for their audience, so they didn't like the structure, the rigid structure of neoclassicism, so they kind of didn't follow it. But this is the beginnings of it. Also, the works that Vitruvius had published came out around this time and translated in France into French in 1547, had really started to push a lot of the neoclassical ideal forth. Serlio was also a resident in the court of Francis I. Serlio, if you recall, wrote De Architectura. He actually wrote it in France in 1545. So we're getting closer and closer to that sort of neoclassicism style. Even though, honestly, scenery still at this time is like that medieval concept of little pieces all over the place, not the nice, cool, moving scenery. That won't come for a little bit. Next we have on the list is Salle du Petit Bourbon. Mid-16th century it was built, becomes one of the most important theater structures in the 16th century, until the 17th century. Alright, 1589. I'm going to lump these three sort of into a whole. Here's basically what happened. In 1589, Henri III was assassinated by a Catholic religious zealot, probably for the assassination of Duke of Guise. Probably why he shouldn't have done that in the first place. But he left no heir, which means his sister had married a man named Henri of Navarre, and he came in and assumed the throne as Henri IV, but he was Protestant. So they wouldn't let him into Paris. He's their new king, he's not allowed to come into Paris. So again, civil wars broke out, and French public and court theater pretty much ceased at that point in time, and it did not revive again until like the 1590s. It really didn't revive again until it revived early 1590s, but it really started kicking in around 1598 when Henri IV created the Edict of Nantes. I don't know if any of you remember that from high school. The Edict of Nantes pretty much gave free reign to Protestants. It was no longer Protestant season as far as the Catholics were concerned. Therefore, you were free to be a Protestant and not be apprehended or not be killed or anything along that line. Which is good, because when you consider the fact that most of your actors and theater practitioners would be Protestants because they're excommunicated anyway. So now all of a sudden this population of actors and writers and all your theater people don't have to hide. Now they're free to be safe and do their art. So that really is what kicks back in theater, is that Edict of Nantes. So that takes care of those three sort of in a row there. Also, the next one, theater almost ceased. Around 1595, theater resumes to a degree. In 1594, Henri IV had converted to Catholicism, was finally allowed to enter Paris. 1595 theater kind of starts again, but it's really of little consequence, because all it really is at this point in time was farce, based off most of the work they'd seen with the Comédie d'Art troops that were still hanging around in Paris. So it really wasn't French theater. So it resumes in 95, but it takes until the Edict of Nantes before theater really blossoms again. Around 1597, right before the Edict of Nantes, you start seeing a few French dramatists start to appear. The first professional one that we have in there is Alexandre Hardy. We'll talk about him more when we get into that section on playwrights. Next thing we have in here is 1597. Also, the Comédie de la Passion stops producing plays. Pretty much what they did at this point in time was they started leasing out the Hôtel de Bourgogne for other troupes. It wasn't until probably around mid-1600s that they actually formed their own troupe, which then became absorbed into another troupe later, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But so they weren't producing their own plays regularly. They were kind of leasing their space. And 1629 we see Richelieu allows acting companies to settle in Paris. Let me back up a little bit here to 1610, because Henri IV is assassinated. Obviously a bad name to have in France is Henri, but he's assassinated. That brings Louis XIII to the throne. Now, Louis is a very, very, very young king, so the real power behind him is Cardinal Richelieu. Yes, this is the Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu of the Three Musketeers, if you are familiar with that story in any way, shape, or form. So in 1629, Richelieu, who is really the real power behind the throne, starts allowing acting companies to settle in Paris. So that monopoly of the Comédie de la Passion is now broken. Acting companies can now come inside and settle in Paris. He also, that same year, begins building the Palais Cardinal, one of the most important court theaters in this era. In 1635, he created what was known as the French Academy of Language and Literature, which is still in existence today. And it was it was made up of 40 of what are considered the greatest literary minds of their time. A lot of names that you would know have sat on this. Oddly enough, Molière did not. He died before he inducted to it. Several of the authors you might think would have been on it died prior to that, to being brought on or were denied. But numerous writers, Alexandre Dumas, his son, who wrote Three Musketeers, he sat on that. So he wrote this in order to foster French literature. Remember I talked about at some point in time, every country tries to create this sort of a national drama. This is that moment. This is that time when France is trying to create its own identity in its drama and literature. Done by Richelieu, created in the hopes that this group of furtive minds would create a national French style of literature. And that's what this does. So Richelieu dies in 1642, and his successor is a man named Cardinal Mazarin. Mazarin in 1645 brings Italian opera to France. Now, this was the first time they really had seen Italian opera, and it became quite popular. Comédie dell'arte troops that were still hanging around in France at the time then petitioned the Queen to bring in an Italian designer so that they could compete with the opera. So she imported an Italian in a little box, came there, opened it up, and he said, ciao. That Italian designer was a man by the name of Giacomo Torelli. Hope you remember him from Italian. He is the creator of Chariot Pole. He came in and was pissed. He was pissed that he was brought in to design something as menial as Comédie dell'arte. He said that he would only design Comédie dell'arte if he was also allowed to design opera. So he was given that opportunity. So for the first opera that he was able to design, he remodeled the Palais Royal, which used to be called the Palais Cardinal. After his death, it was changed over to Palais Royal. He installed a chariot and pole changing system, and then elaborate machinery became the trademark of all good opera from that point on for the next 25 years. All right? That'll change, and I'll tell you about it in a little bit when it's going to change and why it does. 1650s on your notes, it says tragedy loses its appeal. Well, the reason that happened is because one of the greater writers at that time, a man by the name of Pierre Corneille, his recent work, Repertory, was a complete flop, so he quit writing. Just gave it up for many, many years. And then with Civil War and the death of Louis and Richelieu, the theater just kind of declined. Opera was still going well, but tragedy itself was pretty much lost art at that point. So also in 1659, then Mazarin sends to Italy for a new designer, a man by the name of Gaspar Vigarani. And he was a famous scenic designer, but also a designer of theaters. Vigarani shows up and he says, none of these theaters will work for the types of shows that I want to do, so I'm going to build my own theater. And he builds, in 1660, the Salle des Machines, and it is the largest theater in Europe. 52 feet wide, 232 feet long, with only 92 feet for the auditorium. So that means it had a stage depth of 140 feet. Some 36 some odd machines for changing scenery underneath that stage area there. It was massive, and the size of shows they did there were amazing. 1663, Vigarani dies and he leaves his post to his son, Carlo. He takes over that position and continues on the same sort of style of heavy, big machine operas. Now, in 1672, a man by the name of Jean-Baptiste Lully obtains a monopoly on musical performances from the crown. He becomes the founder of French opera. See, what really happened was he got that monopoly in 1672. In 1673, after Molière died, Lully went to his widow and wrested control of the Palais Royal Theatre from her so that he could set up his own Royal Academy of Music and Dance. Sounds kind of bastardish, but that's what he did. And it was that time then that he put an end to those machine plays. This is where that's going to stop. All the big machines and stuff for opera, that goes out the window at this point. Lully stops it. But Carlo Vigarani designs for these operas. And they move toward a different style of design in that, in less flashy, less machine-oriented set designs. Next thing you see in here is 1680, Jean Bérain took over as principal designer from Carlo Vigarani. Now, he had studied with Vigarani, so he becomes actually France's first main designer. Because they didn't have much of them, as you know. They've obviously been importing all these Italian designers. So Jean Bérain actually becomes their first main designer. And when he dies, his son takes over and keeps the post going until about 1721. 1682, the center of government is moved to Versailles. Now, this is important because that's, of course, then where all the court theater would move as well. Versailles is an amazingly huge, elaborate palace, and it cost a lot of money. It's going to be part of the downfall of France. We'll talk about that when we get into why French Renaissance sort of fell. At this time, then, France then replaces Italy as sort of the cultural center of Europe. Now let's look at acting companies. These get really, really confusing, and it helps usually when I have a board behind me and I can draw all this out, but since I don't, you're just going to have to deal with, I guess, me talking about it and hand gestures. Maybe that'll help. We'll start with a man by the name of Valéry Lecomte, who created a company known as the Comédie-Française, which is the Players of the King. They didn't receive any subsidy from the court. That's the name they adopted, and they were one of the first major companies there. This was the most important acting troupe in Paris from 1598 to 1612. And in 1629, when Richelieu started letting other companies settle in Paris, a new company came in and settled in the Hôtel de Bourgogne, and that was one of Lecomte's former actors. This becomes the leading company in Paris from 1647 to 1680. Now, another group had also set up, run by another member of the company. So two members of Lecomte's company split off. One went to the Hôtel de Bourgogne, and one went to the Théâtre du Marais. The Théâtre du Marais company in 1634 becomes immediately the leading company in Paris until 1647, and this is how it works. All right? They got an actual subsidy by Richelieu, who was giving out subsidies by 1634 to lots of groups, but they got a subsidy from Richelieu in 1634, and that helped them top the other two. In 1647, one of the lead actors of the Théâtre du Marais company left and went to the Hôtel de Bourgogne company. That made the Hôtel de Bourgogne company now the leading theater company in Paris from 1647 until 1680. We'll talk about why it ends in 1680 in a minute. All right, this is one of the things about acting companies. They usually were made up of 8 to 12 members. If a leading actor or actress left that company and went to another one, that pretty much became the new leading company in Paris. You always wanted a name actor in there because dramatists would give you plays based on whether you had a good actor or name actor in your company or not. Otherwise, you have to deal with recycled works all the time, and people aren't going to come see that, and the Crown won't come see it. So you're not the lead company in Paris anymore. So this is how they sort of jockeyed for position in there, and this is what happened. So right now, we have sort of three companies: Lecomte's company and his two offshoots, Théâtre du Marais and the Hôtel de Bourgogne company. All right, Lecomte's company sort of pretty much tends to disappear, and you come down to just the Hôtel de Bourgogne and the Théâtre du Marais company. All right. Looking here, 1607, we see the first time we see women allowed in companies. They still had very scandalous reputations. Many of them adopted stage names so they wouldn't be known in public. We talked about actor-dramatist relationship. The cool thing here is the actor financial / social position you see on your notes there. It was a really interesting thing that in 1642, Louis XIII issued a decree stating that his desire was that the actor's profession no longer be considered worthy of blame or public ridicule. Now, it didn't stop the church from still excommunicating them, but all of a sudden, you didn't have that public moniker of, oh, you're an actor, you're a thief, you're scum, you're a vagabond, because the king said it's not the case. So that changed, and they could actually start making money and start having some prestige in town.
How's it going?
And that's actually a little bit further down here. If you see the 1642 Edict of Louis XIII, actors' profession outwardly ablamed, and so on and so forth. That's that one there. And 1629 to 1660 on your list there, that's just basically the time frame between when subsidies started coming in from Richelieu to the acting companies, and so began to change actors' financial positions, right? No longer were they scraping by with pennies. They were actually the theaters were getting subsidies, so they were able to pay their actors better. Overall, life got better for these people because of Richelieu's subsidies and the Edict of Louis XIII. So that's pretty much that whole section right there, down to all companies organized on a share plan. So we can chat about that now. We talked about the share plan, I believe, to some degree in the Elizabethan theater, and the same thing goes here. New members are called pensionnaires, and they don't necessarily have shares in it, like we talked about in Elizabethan theater. They are just actors, and they're paid a fixed sum. You can't deny a role, and you have to do pretty much what you're told to do, and you get a fixed sum for it. The way that their system worked is the Crown set a certain number of people that would be allowed to be a shareholder, which were known as sociétaires, okay? And they were on a 20-year contract. And you were heavily fined if you broke that contract and went to another company. So, pretty much, if you become a shareholder, a sociétaire, you're going to be in that company for 20 years. You're going to retire from that company. The bad thing for pensioners is that, much like the kiddie table to the adult table in Thanksgiving, you're not getting in to be a shareholder if they're all filled until somebody retires, resigns, or dies. That's pretty much it, right? So that's the basic construct of the share plan. So moving down, we covered the roles are cast by the author. I did not actually say that, but there it is. And the actors could not refuse it. Now, until about 1680, all troupes played 3 to 4 days a week, and they played repertory, which means that you had to learn several different shows because the one day could be one show, and another day another show, and so on and so forth. After 1680, they played daily, which means they kept that repertory going. Costumes are very similar to English, but elaborate ones for special characters. They were, especially the evil characters, they would have certain, or historical characters, they would have specific, a lot of the historical characters would put on like a Romanesque type armor with plumed hats and things like that, so I guess that means they're historical. So that's really what we're looking at with costuming in general. It's not very elaborate at this particular point in time, except if it was a court play. If it was a play being shown at court, the court would pay 400 livres, which was their money at the time, for any new costume. Rough estimate of 400 livres in modern money. It was based on silver, so it'd be about 64 ounces of silver, roughly, which would equate to a neighborhood of $1,500 today. So the court would pay roughly $1,500 per new costume used in a play to be shown at court. Now, beginning in 1636, audiences started sitting on stage. It became fashionable to do so. Again, I think I talked about this in Elizabethan theater, right? No, I didn't talk about it in the video, but I mentioned it on one of the posts, that it was fashionable to be seen at the theater. Going to the theater to see the theater, that's okay, but the most important thing is that you were seen at the theater, especially who you're seen with. So now these people started deciding, well, it's better if I'm on stage. I can be seen better, and I've got better seats, and everyone knows how important I am. And actual fights broke out of these seats at some points in times. Not necessarily in France, but this continued on in England and other places as well. And I've got records of actual fights that broke out at that time. So that will stop a little bit later on, and we'll get to that probably in the next, I believe it's in the next section, or the 18th century. All right, so now we're looking at acting. This is where it's going to get really, really confusing. Now we're looking at acting troops in the late 16th century. Okay. Okay. We have Molière's troupe. He had his own troupe, and he was playing at the Palais Royal. He dies in 1673. Remember I said Lully comes and wrests control of the Palais Royal from his widow. So he decides he's going to go to a theater at the Rue Guénégaud. You have the Hôtel de Bourgogne troupe and the Théâtre du Marais troupe, which we talked about, that were offshoots of Lecomte's troupe. Lecomte's troupe pretty much dissipates at this point in time. Well, one of the Hôtel de Bourgogne troupe's noted actresses leaves and goes to Molière's troupe in the Rue Guénégaud. They whine to the Crown about it, and the Crown says, "Don't bitch at me about it, go join them. Just merge into one troupe." So now, Molière's troupe and Hôtel de Bourgogne troupe have merged into one troupe at the Rue Guénégaud. Now we have Molière's troupe, which is Molière and Hôtel de Bourgogne, and Théâtre du Marais. Lully's opera is still going about, so we got 3 troupes there, and you got Comédie de l'Art troupes farting around all over. So the Théâtre du Marais troupe also really wants the theater at the Rue Guénégaud. It's a very good theater. So they go and argue to the Crown about it, why they should have the Rue Guénégaud. The Crown says, "I'm tired of hearing this. Go join them. Just merge." So now we have Molière's troupe, Hôtel de Bourgogne troupe, and Théâtre du Marais troupe all merged into one troupe. So now you're really looking at one troupe and Lully's opera and Comédie de l'Art. So 3 troupes now. That merger of 3 groups, Molière, Hôtel de Bourgogne, and Théâtre du Marais, become known as the Comédie-Française in 1680. And now, by the end of the century, you have just Lully's opera, which becomes known as Paris opera, Comédie-Française, and some spattering Italian Comédie de l'Art troupes, which get expelled in 1697 anyway, so you're really down to 2, Paris opera, Comédie-Française, by the end of the century. And that is the only 2 existing troupes in France at that point in time. Hope that wasn't too confusing. Doing it without being able to write it down on the board is a little difficult, but hopefully that was clear. So, looking at playwrights. First one we have on the list is Pierre de l'Hervé in the late 16th century. He was the first person to sort of mix medieval form and classical form and model his works on the, if you remember this, the Italian Commedia Erudita, but adapted a lot of French locales and manners, so it was sort of beginning to push a French national drama. We have Alexander Hardy, who we spoke about already. He actually started to champion tragedy when farce was really popular. He then switched to tragicomedy and pastorals because tragedy wasn't doing so well. But we start to see a rekindling of the neoclassical idea, and there's 4 major playwrights here. And it's Jean de Marais. He was recognized as one of the leading dramatists at this time. He wrote a play called Sophonisba. Yes, just like the Sophonisba from the Italian drama as well. In 1634, and this was the first real tragedy of the New Age to follow the neoclassical rules. Then you have Pierre de Royer, and he established tragedy as a popular form along with Marais and Corneille. Jean de Rotreux. Jean de Rotreux he did the adaptations of Spanish dramas, actually, and you start to see the theme of love versus honor, which is very, very Spanish, creep into become a staple of the French stage as well. And then, of course, we have Pierre Corneille, probably the most well-known French dramatist of this time, outside of Racine and Molière, we'll talk about in a moment. And he was a triumph of the neoclassical mode in France. His tragedies were considered to be of the best. And he had intrigues, misunderstandings of lovers, replaces comic servants, and sentimental love affairs. He was the writer of the play Les Cid, if you've ever heard of that one. The major turning point in French drama. If you haven't read it, you should read it. Oddly enough, he also set the stage for comedy up to the time of Molière, because nobody could touch Molière in comedy. If you have not read any Molière, you should. I can't believe I didn't make you. So, from French drama, this is now we're looking at a little later in the time frame here, 1660 to 1700, roughly. So late 17th century. You have Jean Racine, who was basically the epitome of French tragedy in the end of the Renaissance, late 17th century era. And Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, who is known as Molière. Molière's a stage name. He didn't want his dad was like some kind of a furniture upholsterer to the court, to the royal family, and so he didn't want to embarrass him, so he changed his name. And he is considered the epitome of comic dramaturgy in French drama. Definitely worth reading all of his works if you get a chance to, except for his one tragedy he wrote. Don't read that. And I don't remember the name of it. I probably blocked it. I want to say it's Pyramus and Thisbe, but I'm not certain. Okay, so then we have theater architecture. Pretty much, we talked about Hôtel de Bourbon, and the Salle du Petit Bourbon I don't have dimensions on. So I'm not going to really belabor that much. Tennis courts are interesting in the fact that tennis courts were commonly refurbished to use as theaters. If you think about it, you've got a long hall with seats on both sides of it so you can watch the action. All you really need to do is put a stage in one end of it, and you've got a fully fleshed out theater already. So, with the grounding area and everything. So, tennis courts were used a lot, and frankly, when they built theaters, they sort of modeled them on that because it worked so well. So, you'll find that tennis courts will actually be used in Restoration era England as well. Scenic practices, because of designers like Tommaso Francini, most of the Italian scenic devices were seen in the French court. Painted backdrops were used. In 1617 they started seeing angled side wings and back shutters. By 1620s you start seeing unified settings, a rake stage and some scene shifting in court theater. But you're still seeing medieval scenery in public theaters well into the 1630s. By 1640, Italianate scenery becomes a matter of artistic principle, not only in the court theater, but also in public as well. Looking at ballet, in the 1640s, it began to recapture the popularity it had in court before 1620. Especially prominent between 1651 and 1660, when Louis XIV actually appeared in many of the ballets. Here's a beautiful picture of him. Look for him online. Louis XIV, Sun King. You'll see him in this incredibly flamboyant, flaming gown, skipping off and doing a ballet pose. It's pretty awesome. But he danced in a lot of ballets, so it gave it a lot more popularity. And it finally began to revive. By the 1660s, comic ballet, which is a favorite of Louis, many of them were written by Molière and Lully. Lully, of course, again being later the founder of French opera. Right? he wrote with Moliere, who was a comic genius. And so these ballets became really popular, and the king loved them, so he danced in them. Looking at decline of the French Renaissance, okay. So you have two monopolies, the opera and Comédie-Française, neither one of them doing what the other's doing. So they basically can sort of sit back and rest on their laurels, and that's what happened. It began to decline because they didn't have anyone pushing them to get better, to do better works. Then Louis XIV, for some weird reason, revoked the Edict of Nantes, and 200,000 Protestants fled the country, many of them being theater folk, actors, writers. So they lost a good deal of their talent when he did that. Louis then quit attending the theater as well, quit dancing in the ballets, which of course then left them open to public ridicule. And for whatever reason, Louis pretty much quit attending the theater, and that made it lose its appeal to the public. He also spent an exorbitant amount of money on Versailles. That, coupled with a bunch of wars, made the country go into a huge deficit. And while it was still probably the most powerful country in Europe, politically and culturally, its energies were being expended elsewhere other than culture, opera, and ballet, and theater. So the theater itself began to decline a great deal around that point in time. And that takes us to the end of French Renaissance, and next we will be looking at Spanish Renaissance next week.